Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This series, it's going to be a long one, so it's going to be many parts. It's on the infamous serial killer Ted Bundy. Disclaimer, these are true crime videos and they're not suitable for children. And they may contain sensitive subject matter, so viewer discretion is advised. Theodore Robert Bundy, known as Ted, was one of the most infamous serial killers of modern time. Ted Bundy was, in my opinion, the real boogeyman. And the media likes to go on and on about how attractive he was. He chose his victims well. He chose the attractive, the friendly, the empathetic, caring, good-natured girls. Those who would lend a helping hand to a stranger. And he repaid their generosity in the most horrible way possible. He upended the concept of the Good Samaritan. Girls from good families were taught to help others in trouble, and he took advantage of that. Ted was a native of Vermont. He was a resident of Washington. He was a convict of Utah, a double escapee of Colorado, a death row prisoner executed in Florida with his ashes scattered back on Taylor Mountain. Ted Bundy is also a part of the history of my state, the state of Florida. His reign of terror ended when he was executed for the murder of Kimberly Diane Leach. And this list here is not exhaustive. There are so many more victims. Look at this face. Do you still think he's attractive? Theodore Robert Bundy was a waste of humanity, not someone to be idolized or fondly remembered. He was a savage, degenerate, perverse, sneaky, and manipulative human being. He said himself that he was not brilliant or handsome and that this was all just part of the myth of Ted Bundy. The thick patina of charm covered a hidden rage against women. And he insisted, quote, "I am not crazy. Everybody knows that," end quote. Let's take him at his word. And in the beginning, there was just Ted. Theodore Robert Cowell was born to Eleanor Louise Cowell, we'll call her Louise, age 22, on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. At 7 months pregnant and unmarried, due to the social stigma of the time, Louise went to this Victorian-style home to await the child's birth. Ted's real father was not in the picture or on his original birth certificate, and the original birth certificates from this home are permanently sealed for 99 years. Now, that wouldn't mean that Louise would not have a copy of her own son's birth certificate. There was speculation that Ted's real father was Louise's own father, Samuel Cowell, but allegedly this was later disproved by DNA evidence. Louise claimed she was seduced by a Navy war veteran named Jack Worthington. Ted weighed 7 pounds, 9 ounces at birth. After his birth at the home, the Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, he was abandoned for 2 months as the family decided what to do. While there, children were referred to with numbers and not names. Allegedly, Samuel Cowell told Louise to go back and get the child. For Ted's first 3 years of his life, he lived in the Philadelphia home with his grandparents and his mother Louise. Depending on what you read and who you talk to, there's some scuttlebutt that Ted believed Samuel was his father, and the 1950 census would bear that out because it does list Ted as the son, age 3, of Sam Cowell. However, Sam was his grandfather, and we don't know if that was just put down just for the census or what. According to Polly Nelson, who'll be one of many later appellate defense attorneys for Ted, Samuel Cowell was a bully. He was cruel to animals, he was bigoted, and he kept dirty magazines in his greenhouse. There was also domestic violence in the Cowell home. However, Ted will later tell Stephen Michaud that he adored his grandfather, Samuel Cowell, that he identified with him and he respected him. Polly Nelson will later also reveal that Louise's mother was hospitalized for depression multiple times and was treated with electroshock therapy or electroconvulsive therapy. And the only notable thing that was odd about Ted at an early age was that an aunt who was living in the home, her name was, I think, Julia, she later went on to recall that around age 3, she woke up and little Ted had placed butcher knives or knives around her while she was sleeping. And all the knives are pointed right at her body. And I think he giggled when she woke up. So that was extremely odd. Louise Bundy would always insist that Ted was a good baby. And in order to be fair, let's watch some of Louise's testimony on this subject.
Do you have any children, Mrs. Bundy?
Yes, I have 5 children.
And who is your oldest child?
My oldest child is Ted.
When was Ted born?
November 24th, 1946.
And where was Ted born?
In Burlington, Vermont.
Who raised Ted as an infant and as a young child?
I did.
And where were you living at that time?
Well, for the first couple of years of Ted's life, I lived in Philadelphia with my family.
Let's step back for a moment, because with someone who will later reveal themselves to be a serial killer, there's always going to be a discussion of nature versus nurture. Ted Bundy will be revealed to be a sociopathic killer. But was his biological father also prone to sociopathy? We don't know, because after all, that birth father left Louise Cowell after she got pregnant without so much as a backward look. So that would be his biological nature, his makeup. The nurturing part would consider the fact that he perhaps was left in this home for 2 months, possibly not receiving enough mothering in those 2 months. And then once he went and retrieved, his grandfather's behavior surely also had an influence as well, whether it was negative, positive, or both. And his family's lack of disposable money will also be an issue with Ted. He will talk about his feelings of inferiority and that this led to a fascination with material possessions. And in my opinion, once his hormones started to kick in, the urge for physical material possessions mixed with seeing explicit detective magazines made some kind of weird mental concoction and aberration wherein then he'll later want to possess women. But right now, let's go back to Louise's remembrance of Ted's childhood.
Did there come a time when you moved to Tacoma, Washington?
Yes, I had very close relatives in Tacoma, and they thought it was a great place to live, so Ted and I moved there.
And what, if anything, happened in your life after you moved to Tacoma, Washington?
Well, I met a very wonderful man named John Bundy, and we were married a few months later.
And was Ted adopted by John Bundy?
Yes, he was.
And how old was he when he was adopted?
He was 4 and a half.
In 1950, for a fresh start, Louise went to live with a relative in Washington. At this time, she randomly changed Ted's last name to Nelson on October 6, 1950. In 1951, Louise met Johnny Culpeper Bundy at a church social at the First United Methodist Church. Johnny Culpeper Bundy was a diminutive man from the Ozarks with a southern accent. And when Louise married him on May 19th, 1951, they moved away, and Johnny Bundy adopted Ted at age 4 and a half. Here's the birth certificate. Louise and Ted and Johnny, they settled in Tacoma, Washington. Johnny was a cook at the Veterans Administration, a job that he had for decades. The family was relatively apolitical and not religious zealots, but they did attend church every Sunday.
Could you describe for us Ted's early childhood and his upbringing? How did you raise Ted?
Well, we tried to be very conscientious parents, ones who did things with our children, gave them the best we could give them on a middle-class income, but mostly we wanted to give them lots of love.
What did your husband do?
My husband did and has been a cook at Madigan Army Hospital at Fort Lewis, Tacoma.
For how many years has he been a cook there?
Since 1952.
And have you worked outside the home?
Not until 7 years ago. I stayed home with the children until 7 years ago.
Johnny and Louise had children, and Ted was the oldest sibling in the family. He had 2 half-brothers, Richard and Glenn, and 2 half-sisters, Sandy and Linda. And since there was an age difference with his siblings, he would commonly end up babysitting them. His room growing up had been in the basement, and he was embarrassed to bring his friends home because he said it was unfinished. And I want to note for the record, for the future episodes, note basement. Basement. This is important. In the basement, Ted enjoyed listening to the radio. He developed his verbal skills from listening to a lot of radio. Talk radio was his favorite. He would listen to call-in shows, and he would fashion answers to the questions, and he enjoyed eavesdropping on other people's conversations. Ted felt confident in elementary school and hanging with the kids around his neighborhood. He had friends, and he participated in the Boy Scouts, sometimes with Johnny Bundy.
Ted went to school in Tacoma. All his schooling was in the city of Tacoma public schools.
And during that period of time, did you help Ted with his studies?
Oh, yes. I can remember many a night we stayed up way past midnight when he had a big exam coming up, and I'd try to help him with reading off questions I thought he might be getting, and he'd work it out.
Was Ted a conscientious student?
Very much so.
As a teenager, approximately 13, Bundy learned from his cousin John that he was illegitimate. According to his later girlfriend, Liz Klepfer, Ted resented that he didn't learn about his illegitimacy from his own mother. And she will recall that Ted was literally shaking when he confesses this to Liz. And she didn't think it was a big deal. But he had feared that the illegitimacy might change her opinion of him. And he was literally crying in her lap when he told her about this. And this, mind you, was whenever he was in college. So the story goes that this cousin takes Ted to the attic and shows him a birth certificate with the father listed unknown. And that Ted's mother later told Liz Klepfer that at the age of 5, Ted has stuck his hand in Louise and Johnny's wedding cake. So she just assumed that Ted always knew that Johnny wasn't his father because he was there at their wedding. She just assumed that Ted's memory went back that far. So it just wasn't discussed. And so Ted's mom never mentioned the paternity issue to him because she just thought he remembered it. But later on, Ted will be very dismissive or indifferent to his stepfather. Maybe he was always dismissive and indifferent, but he becomes more dismissive, more indifferent. Ted later will claim that he harbors no ill feelings of anger towards his mother, that she sacrificed for him and the family, she paid the bills. But when Ted was confiding to Liz about his illegitimacy, he allegedly asked Liz if he should confront Louise about it, and Liz said no, and Ted just cried about it. So it did bother him. Furthermore, his illegitimacy was not ever discussed with his brothers and his sisters. Ted later said that his mother never spoke about personal matters, that she wasn't emotionally expressive. He said that she was extremely intelligent, but she masked it. And in my opinion, Ted was her favorite. That's just my opinion. And Ted had a favorite. His favorite was his youngest brother, Richard Bundy, who he would later take hiking and rafting, and they both adored each other. And since they had a mid-sized family and a middle-class existence, the family was frugal. And then there's high school. Ted believes that he hit the wall socially in high school because he was smaller than the other boys, he was underweight, he didn't make a sports team, and he started feeling alienated at the Woodrow Wilson High School. He was introverted, insecure, lonely, had a fear of socializing. He just started feeling different than the other people. And he was a bit of an aloof loner who used academics in order to occupy his time and his mind. And everyone would agree that he was precocious in a formalized setting like school. He adopted an aloof, almost snotty manner as a defense mechanism. But he was odd, like he was obsessed with socks. He said he always felt deprived of underwear and socks, and that continued the rest of his life. Bundy bit his nails. I think it was Keppel that said he picked his nose. He stuttered when he was nervous, and he still would show that even in later years. If he got really nervous, he would stutter. He later admitted to engaging in voyeuristic behavior, like a peeping Tom, and then he became a peeping Tom for years. Ted would later go on to say that when he would commonly engage in this voyeuristic activity, he was commonly also drinking alcohol, and that when he was younger, he would pick through the trash in order to find these explicit materials, consume them, and then he would shred it in disgust, just like he would later use, abuse, possess women as objects. In the spring of 1965, he was arrested twice in Pierce County, thought to be a suspicion of burglary and an auto theft, both crimes, which are both consistent with his later behavior, by the way, were expunged from the Washington state records. By Ted's account, he didn't enjoy high school. He did rather well academically. He didn't enjoy it. And he thought of his city, Tacoma, as basically boring and ugly, and that it was stinky. He called it the Tacoma aroma. Apparently, there was a pulp mill there that made the town stinky, and he just really wasn't all that impressed. Louise had a brother, Uncle Jack, the father of the cousin John, who opened Pandora's box. And this Uncle Jack had some sophistication, and Ted later modeled himself after this well-off relative. And Ted found Uncle Jack to be attractive and compelling and cultured and intelligent, and in many ways he wanted to be like this Uncle Jack. But after high school, Ted, who signs his name with a lowercase t, so Ted of the lowercase t, is still not yet to spread his wings and leave Tacoma. So in the next part, we're going to look at Ted's early relationships, his early schooling, his early jobs, and people's recollections to try to figure out how he became what he did. And rather than read them out, let me show you my sources for this series. Here are some of the case files I'm pulling from. And here's some of the books that I own and have read. And I looked through the trial records and then the internet resources. I always use newspapers.com. I use internetarchive.org. It's a free service, by the way. And I highly recommend the Hi, I'm Ted blog and Facebook page. So if you like the intro to this series, please do the YouTube-y things. Press that like button, hit the subscribe bell, and you'll be notified of part 2 when it's up. I believe it's going to be called Ted of the lowercase t. And if you feel so inclined, you can even hit that super thanks, because I don't get paid off of these. These are usually demonetized. So without further ado, have an excellent day. Bye.